Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. We are live from the internet here at Books and Books. This is the cultural heart of Coral Gables. On behalf of everyone here, we welcome you. Please check out our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a rundown of all the great events we have at Books and Books every night of the week. We do about 60 plus events every month. We do kids events, we do Spanish events, we have poetry readings, first-time authors, even celebrity signings. A couple of note I'd like to make mention of. We've got Jasper Ford will be joining us. Actually, tomorrow we'll be here in the Gables. Paul Williams and Tracy Jackson, famous songwriter Paul Williams, will be joining us next Monday. Martin Amos, we have tickets on sale for that with his new book, The Zone of Interest. So any number of events, as I say, for everyone's taste. You can also see that by the lights and the cameras here in the store, we do live stream a lot of our events through the internet. So I will tell you that for the benefit of people watching, these lights and cameras that are facing the audience, that you make sure you're sitting next to who you're supposed to be sitting next to. I also remind you that flash photography interferes with the live stream presentation, so please refrain from doing that. Again, I encourage you to visit our site for more information for all the goings on here. You can also give us your email address once you go there so we can send you email blasts for everything so you don't miss a thing. And if you do decide to watch any of these events through the internet, you can always call the store at the number on the screen for a signed copy of the book that we'll mail to you free of charge anywhere in the U.S., and you can also call and ask a question of the author while the event is in progress. But tonight we're very happy to have with us Jeffery Allen and his book, Song of the Shank. To introduce the author tonight is the editor of the Literary Review, his friend and colleague. Please welcome Jesse Alfieri.
Thank you. Hello. I'm really happy to be able to introduce Jeffery Allen, who I first met as a graduate student at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where he teaches, and who has become a good friend. This summer, Jeff read from his latest book, Song of the Shank, which he will read from tonight, at Book Court in Brooklyn, a reading I was lucky enough to attend. I noticed at that reading that Jeff was wearing a Jimi Hendrix t-shirt, and I asked him about it. And he told me that Hendrix had been one of the catalysts for Song of the Shank, in the sense that he saw the character in this book, Blind Tom, as a kind of 19th century Jimi Hendrix. I remembered something Jeff had recently told me, and I asked him, "You thought seriously about being a musician when you were a teenager, right?" He shot me a look of disbelief. "I just like wearing the clothes. I never actually practiced." Candy coating the truth is not Jeff Allen's thing. He likes to get to the heart of matters and then to go even further to the soul. Kirkus said in their starred review of Song of the Shank, "Allen's psychological insight and evocative language vividly bring to life all the black and white people in Tom's life. If there's any justice, Allen's visionary work, as startlingly inventive as one of his subjects' performances, should propel him to the front rank of American novelists." Tom Nolan of the San Francisco Chronicle said, "Allen renders these folk and their chaotic existences with grittiness, inherent sympathy, and intuitive grace. There are echoes, however oblique or not, in this potential great American novel of past masters: Faulkner, Hemingway, Ellison, Melville, John Edgar Wideman, Ishmael Reed." Please join me in welcoming Jeffery Allen.
Well, thank you all for coming, and Jesse, thank you so much for your generous introduction. And also thank you for making this, helping to make this event possible. So it's a great honor to be here. This is only my second time in Miami, strangely enough. So what I thought I would do tonight is to talk a little bit about the origins of the book and the process of writing the book, and then I'll read maybe 3 short passages from the novel, and then if there are any questions, I could take some questions from you all. Given that I've talking so much about the novel in the past months, I try not to repeat myself and try not to bore myself, actually, at the same time. But the project more or less began many years ago in 1998, when at the time I had more or less finished my first novel and was just sort of reading things of interest or things I thought might be interesting. And I happened to be reading a book by Oliver Sacks, who many of you I'm sure know, the neurologist and writer. And in his book called An Anthropologist on Mars, he actually references Blind Tom in the footnote, and that was the first time I had ever heard of him. So I did a little research at the time about Blind Tom, and I was, really intrigued to discover that he was, like the first African American to play at the White House, to perform at the White House, and this was in the 1850s when he was 10 years old. Blind Tom, or as his name was in actuality, Thomas Green Wiggins, was born a slave in Georgia in 1849. And the mythology says that at around the age of 2, he crawled up to a piano and began playing. The family that owned him essentially owned a piano as well, and the wife was a piano instructor. So that's how he was associated with the piano, became attached to the piano, because it of course was very uncommon at the time for African Americans to play piano, let alone an African American slave to play piano. But by age 6, he began giving concert recitals. And then, as I mentioned, at age 10, he played the White House when Buchanan was president. And in fast order, he had a tremendously popular career. He played all across the United States, all across the United Kingdom, all across Europe. And he was probably the most successful pianist of the 19th century in terms of concert tickets sold and in terms of appearances, that he made and that kind of thing. And he was essentially vastly successful and popular well into the late 1880s. And in the 1880s, he essentially retired from playing by refusing one day to go on stage and perform, and that's kind of what happened. So he was in retirement for a good 10 years or more, and then in the early part of the 20th century, he reappeared during the vaudeville era and played for a few years as really Bill Lowe. Essentially, he suffered a stroke not long after that, and then died in 1908 in Hoboken, New Jersey. So that's kind of his story. So one of the things I was fascinated about was the fact that, here was this guy who had had this tremendously popular career, who was a celebrity, who many famous people had written about, Ulysses Grant, Mark Twain, Willa Cather, and goes on, and who also apparently gave these really astounding performances where he could do things such as play 3 songs at once in different keys. He would play one song with his left hand in one key, another song with his right hand in another key, and then sing a third song in a different key. He had largely classical repertoire, but he would do these also incredible kinds of performances that involved incredible feats of memory and things of that sort. So I was very intrigued by the fact that he'd had this tremendously popular career, but now in the 20th century, he had essentially disappeared from history, and I was interested in knowing why that had happened. And I was also just interested in the fact, as Jesse said at the beginning, that he reminded me a lot of a kind of 19th century Jimi Hendrix in terms of his radical approaches to performing on stage. And he also reminded me of someone like the jazz great Rashawn Roland Kirk, who was also blind and who would do things like play 3 saxophones at once and play a flute with his nose and all these kinds of things. So those were kind of the things that drew me to him. And then I spent, I guess maybe about 3 years after that, I had a fellowship at the New York Public Library, and that's where I began to research his life in earnest, and spent a few years researching him. And then I began writing the novel and proper around about 2003, and it took me about 10 years from that point to finish the novel in 2013. So that's pretty much what happened. what should I say? Like, this is a book that nearly killed me to write, and it's the kind of thing where, when you work on a book for so long and, for 10 years like this, and you put in 4 or 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes more, you really say, this is the last book I ever write. I'll never do this to myself again, and all those kinds of things, which is probably still holds true. I haven't started a new novel, because I'm afraid that maybe 10 years await me. But, I have other projects in mind. So in any case, one of the things that really began to happen, the difficulty in writing the novel for me, the difficulty was really in figuring out a way to make Blind Tom's story my own story, in terms of making it into an actual novel and something more than a biography. So that's really what's the challenge. And it took me a while to figure out how to do that. So one of the things that happened is I got immensely interested in the Civil War draft riots in New York City in 1863, which, interestingly enough, is also a kind of historical moment that is not a common part of our popular imagination or popular consciousness. It doesn't get represented all that often. As far as I can remember, only the movie Gangs of New York has any kind of representation of that. And also there may be a novel or two where it comes up. So I got interested in that idea, and then I developed this notion that Blind Tom was given a concert in New York when the draft riots began, and he was attacked but somehow survives, and but essentially all of the black people of New York City are driven out of the city, or driven out of Manhattan onto this island called Edgemere, which is off the coast of Manhattan somewhere. And Blind Tom is essentially the only character. Blind Tom is essentially the only black person who remains in New York when the novel begins, and it opens in 1866 and it ends in 1869. So I think what I might do is, in fact, just read a short section from the beginning. So what happens is that when the book opens, Tom is living with a woman named Eliza, who is the widow of his former manager. The former manager himself having been killed during the draft riots. And so they have been living together for 3 years. And it's a very conflicted relationship in that, on the one hand, she, as everyone else, is really, overwhelmed by his music. She loves his music, but also he's a very demanding person to be with. And so the novel opens with, basically, it begins with Eliza as the point of view character in the first part of the book, and it goes from there. So I'm just going to read a short section that gives a sense of what their relationship is like. His skin is ready. He holds his arms closely to his chest, as if determined to guard this limited part of his nakedness. Flabby mounds, not unlike almost a woman's breast, belly buttons and layers of abdomen, suggesting the bird's eye view of a volcano. This part of his nakedness holds and wobbles toward the tub, hauls his legs up one after the other over the high porcelain side, and joins her neck deep in high islands of foam. It's the only way she can get him to bathe, the two of them together, two huddled forms stationed at either end of the tub, face to face, an archipelago of suds between them, two bodies peeling away layer by layer, soap the substance that obscures when it is smeared across cheek and brow, nose and chin, before running white fingers over muscle, bone, soft places, hard places, knows them all, making it hard to tell which leg or elbow, one outside, one inside, belongs where to whom. She reaches to slow down his wild, hurried hands. Rebuffed, cut short, they go moving like dark fish through the water, swimming to another world. She grows considerate, guides him back, hands that work as hard returning as running away, stroking her face, downstroking her shoulders, drawing warmth across her breast until he takes tight hold of her silent back. She lets his touch linger, feeling the power of his fingers, this body embracing her, reminding her that she is not alone. He reaches up and fists a hank of her hair, letting the strands seep through his splayed fingers, hairs pushing against each other, flickering back and forth, a mass of flowers set afire under his water-warm touch. Two bodies light and clean. She dries Tom, then herself, using the same towel made from Georgia cotton. Two bodies light and clean, smelling of lavender soap and talcum powder. He dresses her, she him, her form preserved under the wide, heavy folds of her nightgown. Tom exotic in his white sleeping caftan and peak nightcap, like something out of an oriental tale, Arabian Nights. Back in the parlor, she takes a seat on the settee, and he kneels at her feet, rests his head on the altar of her lap, lets her, kneads her to massage his scalp, harvesting the naps, black buds blooming open. Unexpectedly, he pulls himself up mid-touch and ambles off to the piano, where he sits on the bench, hands positioned above the keys. And he stays that way, still withdrawn, music withheld, leaving her to measure the distance between them. It's as if he knows that something is up. She feels a deep sense of gnawing discomfort, but refuses to let it take hold. No use trying to draw him in. He'll find his way to bed. In fact, she should allow him to savor this hour. She rises, heavy-filled skin, and snuffs the lamps. With no light to guide her, she starts her ascent up the impossible mahogany staircase, reaching out for the inclined railing to steady her. Pain sets off in her hand. She realizes that she has actually grabbed the blade-like finial, which is carved in the form of a fiery torch, with pointed top and sharp spiraling edges, rather than the customary polished globe. Soon finds herself sitting upright on the bed, its circular shape so familiar to her bottom and the soles of her feet, yet she feels like an exile in an unknown space, her fears scrawled into words on the unmade sheets, lets her head fall back into the pillows, her turn to be quiet. Right. So that's one of the sections. So in the novel, what I attempt to do is to tell Tom's story through the eyes of a number of characters, principally 7 characters, with Eliza being the first person we meet really in the novel, and the book actually ends with her as well in 1869. In that sense, it's not a novel about slavery, even though it's been described that way, but it's really a novel about the period of Reconstruction. It's actually set during the first years of Reconstruction, and the book in part is largely about that phenomenon, which hasn't been represented much in our culture either. We have many books about slavery and other kinds of things about slavery. So one of the things I attempt to do in the book is to essentially leave Tom as a mysterious character, which is to say that we never actually enter his mind directly, but we only know him through what we see him do, what we hear him say, what other people think about him, the speculations they have about him and such. And so what I try to do is to make him into a concrete character, but also mysterious character. And it may be true that in actuality he was certainly exploited. He was a slave. He was a young kid when he first began performing. In actuality, he gave concerts that supported the Confederate cause. Some of his most famous compositions celebrated Confederate victories, right? So he's a very problematic figure in terms of, he's not the poster child for for black civil rights or something like that. So so on the one hand, in the novel, he is also that person as well. You know, he is exploited. He is everyone in the book wants to use him for their own purposes, for their own gain. But at the same time, I also tried to make Tom into a very active character. You know, he is an agent of his own destiny, primarily because the things that make him interesting and strange to many people are also the things that make him difficult. The fact that he's blind, the fact that he may be autistic, since it's generally believed that he was most likely an autistic savant, right? So these things are all the things that also make him actively into what could I say? His difficulty makes him into a very active character in the novel. So, and one of the other things I try to do is to, one of the challenges in writing about music is just representing the music itself. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to have each character perceive the music differently and have each character get something different from the music. However, in one section of the novel, the narrator, a kind of omniscient narrator, speculates a little bit about the origins of Tom's music. And I'm just going to read that. It's quite short. I should say, in fact, one of the things that was interesting in reading about Tom's actual life is that it seems that people who went to see him perform believed that they were having an encounter with the supernatural, right? Because as Mark Twain put it, like, Tom's musical powers come from either God or the devil, right? So why was that? Mark Twain was a fairly liberal person, but like most people of the time, the idea of black genius was something that most Americans could not accept. So first of all, Tom's managers and owners created this mythology that he had no musical education, that he had no musical training, that his powers it came out of the blue, which to some degree is true, but his biographer, Tom's biographer, discovered that in fact he worked with trainers throughout his life, and also the notion that his managers were the first ones to create the notion that he was idiot savant, as it was called at the time. And from a factual standpoint, savants usually don't create original material, but Blind Tom penned about 500 original compositions, right? So his principal biographer, a woman named Geneva Southall, she argues that Tom, in fact, was simply a musical genius, but that his managers created this idiot savant persona as a way of selling concert tickets, but also as a way of catering to racist notions about black people's intelligence at the time. That obviously a black person would not be capable of playing a European classical music, since that would require this intelligence and refinement that black people supposedly lacked and all that. So this is a long way of saying that in the novel, what I attempt to do is to leave it to the reader to think about the music itself and what it all means. Because I think it's hard to write a book where your character is simply a savant, because that essentially robs your principal character of any kind of human complexity, emotional complexity, that kind of thing. So anyway, in this section, the question is, where does the music come from? Does it come from God or the devil, or does it come from somewhere else? I'll just read a little bit of this. He can't see it, can only feel its warmth on his skin, feathers of light and shadow, steady light. Everything waits to be seen, wants to be seen and remembered. The world taunts him with its sights, but touch is his primary means of witnessing the world, taking stock. Fingers, the pattern, ridges of tree bark, which reveal less of what is actually there, weight, density, offering only the skeletal outline of some longing. Sounds, two birds warbling in motionless air, a barking dog, snakes in tree branches that repeat the same songs, and frogs that croak slowly in day, and crickets that chirp quickly in night, and ants that dance a frenzy over a meal, and the crackling noise of a flame. Animation surprises him. What lives leans into the sun. Flies hovering about his nose, a mingling of pleasure and suspense. He does not drive them away. The world rushes at him alarmingly from every side. How do his fingers measure and remember? In vibrations of grass, earth records the sound and intensity of falling shafts of sun. In things man-made too, the peanut shelling machine's gyrations forever imprinted in the soil below. Arms and legs moving at the same time, big circles and small circles, tiny rituals, ceremonies, accidents of air. Nothing strange about sound pressing in, showing a sense of mission. Place, names rise from locations, 100 gates. These few sound segments of breath he rehearses. The syllables of his name skip across his tongue. Thomas, where do you live? Whose boy are you? Boy, where do you live? Even if there is tangible distance between saying and meaning, a distance that keeps enlarging in breadth and range. The sun drifts back inside, hidden behind a curtain of clouds, already damp, beginning to swell. Stars penetrate along with the smell of the fields, the stable, the shed, and the gardens, paths and roads. Freshness, a shift in the way he feels. His legs hold him upright, his head floating off where birds fly past. This body isn't his, he doesn't own it, but moves when he moves, takes him traveling, easy gating the long way round, knows it all the way. He can hear the sound of his own breathing, does he own it? His feet working harder now on the earth. Home, what else would he call it? The keys line up like hogs in a pen. They are cool when he touches them, as if he is submerging his hands in a cold stream. Trees bend toward earth and strong wind, the longest leaning touch, each a shadow of the other. Is it any wonder he sang like that? Why he played like that? So one of the things that happens is, so in the first part of the book, Tom is with Eliza, and this guy, this kind of a hustler named Tabbs Gross, who was a black, what would we call him, an entrepreneur, a black entrepreneur, sort of shows up and says he's going to take Tom back to his mother. So in the second part of the book, one of the things that happens is Tom is actually reunited with his mother after a period of many years of separation. And I'm going to just read a little bit of a section where she tries to reconnect. In the second part of the book, they are actually on the island of Edgemere itself, the first part in the city, now in Edgemere. And so they're basically in a chapel, and she's trying to reconnect with him. I will read a little bit of this, and then I think I'll just stop there. He isn't talking, he isn't playing, he isn't even moving. Her Thomas, my Tom, hunkered down in high stiff silence at the piano on the stage above her, face bowed, body slanted forward, his hands in his lap, black skin and black wood glistening with wet light pouring in through the chapel's 4 windows, so high up, 20 feet or more, that she can see the sky and little else, a sky swept clean of everything except for a few infrequent tatters, birds, bats, streaking in and out of vision, cutting across the blue living hand of the Almighty. He who lifted her up from that peculiar country where her blood was harvested along with the cotton, sorghum, tobacco, coffee, and carried her across land and water and set her down on this island Edgemere, then carried her across the threshold into the broad, sturdy, white stone edifice, the home for the education and edification of African orphans, tucked away at the far end of one of Edgemere's ancient and narrow streets, tucked away here where she can be reunited with Thomas, her Thomas, my Tom, At that far point of their lives, mother and son on the verge of great joy after an existence of great sorrow, granted the means to pick up from where they left off 11 years ago, when Thomas was so rudely and wrongly taken from her at 100 Gates. A moment that her mind holds on to and will hold on to, so help her God, for as long as she lives. Never forget, never forgive. I am Thomas, I am here, your mother is here. Here we are together again. Words she might have even spoken once or twice to him since her arrival on Edgemere. Waiting for light or food or drink to make a difference and brighten his mood, raise his spirits and pull words out of him and save her from another lost afternoon, another lost day inside this chapel where her thoughts are a little less each day. The small parts of herself that she has retained, what is felt in her heart and felt in the blood, the small parts of herself that she has retained among the many lost through both the coming of age and through stolen time. Everything that was taken away from them when they were taken away from each other 11 years ago, those small parts that remain that she wants to give back to him, needs to give back. The debt she owes, the dues she must pay, needs to get back, breaking away from her little by little each day, like the specks of late afternoon dust carried along high above her, and the light streaming in through the chapel's four windows. Those small parts breaking away until soon in the course of time, nothing will be left. Crucial not only that they establish and maintain whatever they can, moment by moment, but also that they regain, recover anything he remembers from their past lives at 100 Gates. The 20 feet separating them, a telescopic space that can slide back in time 11 years. Thomas up there on stage at the piano, and she down here on a pew. Perfect silence sealed on the piano's shiny wooden surface as it is on his burnished skin. His silent tongue hidden inside his mouth. The black and white keys hidden under the lacquered lid. The names of the many places that worked her ragged bright inside her, Athens, Leland, Rome, and the names she has forgotten, where she had day after day staggered through fields and kitchens and bedrooms and outhouses, sold or traded or bartered or rented out or shuttled about from one plantation or estate or farm to another in her long career as a slave. These names of places, a contagious song picked up by other presences rising up around her in the room. The dozen or more niggers planted inside glass-fronted frames who assert themselves in song, their proud and heroic countenances sprouting flower-like from high, stiff collars, their voices falling through her from where they hang ghostly from the walls, painted the color of everything and nothing. This choir of faces on the wall, whose identities are a mystery to her, although she recognizes 2 or 3 faces from years ago in the pages of a newspaper. They sing in a foreign tongue, voices ascending in a long climb that might go all the way to heaven, up to a listening God, but for the plastered ceiling, a ceiling strong and sturdy in its construction like all the others here on Edgemere. The voices hold in orbit a little longer before they start a slow slide down the walls and large cross nailed to the wall behind the stage, the voices pulling around the bottom of the altar, which ripples with the reflection of gold-carved letters. When shall we live if not now? Now the voices spill over the edge of the stage onto the floor, which is made from the same wood, and the voices tied forward to flood this entire sparse chapel that offers nothing pleasing to the eye other than rows of pews worn smooth with age, each sculpted from an entire trunk of a tree, solid and thick to withstand the destructive force of a child, enough of them to seat 100 orphans or more. All the day the song will hum inside her. She should speak up, say something, say anything, and put an end to it, but she doesn't want to ruin any hours she and Thomas spend together, enough simply to spend them together. It is always toward him that her longings turn, a moment followed by a lesser moment and a hunger to return. They are from each other. I am you, Entangled in the soul and knotted in the flesh, the spirit of union is uppermost in her. She tells herself, as she did yesterday and the day before, and probably will do tomorrow, that she is on free ground. It is from here that everything can come. It is here, right here in this chapel, that everything begins. No matter how late in life, she is not immune to fresh experience. Ask her where she's been. She'll tell you where she's going. Her life was lived away from here in that unchanged country that the Almighty told her she had to abandon. He who decided that she should make a life elsewhere because she had found favor in his sight, and he sent her an angel who brought her here to Edgemere and reunited her with Thomas and bestowed his blessings upon them in succulent abundance, delicious food and drink, beautiful garments, spacious and comfortable quarters where she can settle into soft sleep each night and awaken anew each morning. Each day runs its course simply enough. Tom will shed his sleeping tunic, hunker down in the tub, and make the water sing, his hands forming lending shapes to the suds. She will kneel before the tub and help him with soap and rag, his bones dancing under her fingers, the only time in the course of day when he allows her to touch him. Are you her? He will ask her. Yes, she says, but his interest in her soon disappears. He will dress himself, then take his place at the table, the sun spilling its copper glow onto and across the room. Thomas, lathered in golden light, honey amber, stuck inside his silence with deliberation. Dressing, she will be hardly uncertain, afraid about who she has become and who he is and what he has become and what he recalls. Does he remember or has he forgotten who she is? After all, it has been 11 years, 11 long years. And perhaps something about her has changed. Smell, sound of her voice, the way she walks, the sound of her footsteps. Or might it be that this is somebody else in the supposed form of her son, a somebody who bears her son's names? She studies the creases edging his eyes, the bones pressing up from under the cheeks, the places where the skull turns outward, revealed, and his clothes sagging from his bones, his face, his whole bony frame. He looks like he might dissolve. He must eat because she wants him to see him looking like a man, the way he looked when she first saw him again after 11 years, all thickened and broadened into man skin and man muscles. But in her presence, he eats almost nothing and drinks almost nothing and never goes to the toilet. Something in him has turned, settled, quieted down, something essential. When she knew him, when he was still hers 11 years ago, it took 2 or 3 hours of him roaming through the countryside to tire him out sufficiently to keep him seated long enough to have his supper. She, Mingo, and the girls had grown used to little Thomas, wandering off from the cabin to the fields, down by the sides of the deep river and the lonely streams, bounding over the hills, or rolling like a log across the plain, headstrong into the deep and gloomy woods. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit here. Okay, back to the present. I am the one, Thomas would say to her, and there she and Thomas would be, brightening in the colors of Miss Bethune's garden, with their chores to get back to, So day in and day out, she took the little that Mr. Bethune gave and made do. Nothing to occupy her hours other than work. All the time in the world on her hands and no time. The rigidity of her station in life, the lack of options, no true leisure to speak of. She would let her imagination loose on any sights that crossed her vision. Look up and remark on the shape of the clouds, going from herself to herself as far as her feet could carry her, to the very edge of the estate's grounds, or to another town or city within walking distance when the Bethunes sent her on errands. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't succeed in desiring none places whose existence she couldn't verify with her own eyes, although she had heard about people and even knew certain people who had supposedly sojourned to or taken up residence in some of those places that had names such as Atlanta, Oxford, London, Paris, Zanzibar. In fact, she had her doubts that another world existed. What Union, what North, what Washington, what White House? Had her doubts that another world existed right up to the moment that the steamship whose deck she and Mr. Tabbs, her angel, stood on, pulled into the city's harbor. It took little convincing to get her on board that ship. Mr. Tabbs made his offer and she gladly accepted it. She was ready for adventure. The prospect filled her with joy. She and Thomas would be reunited. 1,000 miles between them, a moment that perhaps she and her son both dreamed of. She from 100 Gates and he from wherever he was on this earth. So she told herself that she would voyage in order to see this other world that she didn't know. That was the real reason why she accepted Mr. Tabbs' offer. That was the real reason she was so willing to believe in his promises and also believe that Thomas was alive somewhere in this other world. That life she had thought was a permanent part of her, branded on her skin. Then the Almighty brought her here to Edgemere by his beneficent hand so that she could repose her body and have peace of mind with time at her disposal to get reacquainted with Thomas, her first reprieve from industry in her many years of residence on this earth. Now she feels parts of herself that she never felt before, muscles she never knew she had. She repositions her feet on the floor of the chapel without the old agility and grinds her teeth in annoyance. Thomas moves his head ever so slightly at the noise. Could it be, she wonders, that hard labor, constant work, the daily routine of toil enabled her to bear up better than this present inactivity? For at 100 Gates, where the hour and the minute ruled her, she perceived the flow of time less. She plants herself deeper into the pew, but is she really here? No, she is still there at 100 Gates, watching the carriage wobble off down the tree-lined road. Everything grows up around that image. Where she is now, this home, sprouts up right through tufts of grass on the estate. The floor is shrinking beneath her. She looks up and sees the dust motes above floating and swaying in reverse out through the windows, taking the years back from her, 11 years. She looks at Thomas. His face is disappearing, particles of skin pulling away into a tiny cloud. The ceiling is lifting and she starts to rise too. Her new life here on Edgemere, her new life here with Thomas is only something she has dreamed up. A dream that began the moment she and Mingle stood in broad afternoon light at 100 Gates, watching in outraged resignation as the carriage left the way it had come down the tree-lined gravel road. She wants him, her Thomas, to know that if she gets angry at him, if she voices any displeasure, he must know that it is only her past attacking him. Forgive her. Her resentments, her disappointments, her feelings of isolation, indifference, and resignation followed her here, but she has crossed over, so how can she allow herself to think that way? She should be rejoicing. There is life in abundance for future years. Thomas is here with her now. That old life is gone. Maybe I should stop there. So, okay. Thank you. Well, that goes on and on for a while. So, but and then there are other characters in the novel and various sorts of types and voices and so on. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell, and a 600-page book in the time. So I don't know if there are any questions or anyone would like to ask. Yes.
Yeah, you just mentioned all the different characters in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into that space of writing so intimately about such different kinds of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think for some writers really feel a difficult challenge in trying to write about the other, as we sometimes call it, someone who's unlike yourself. But for me, that's part of what it simply means to be a writer, which is to say that our job is to put ourselves into the shoes of other people and try to imagine who they are from inside out. So, from the time I really conceived of the book, I always knew that, Thomas, Blind Tom, would be the center of the book, but that the book was really about the impact that he had on these other people, and how the lives of these other people also represented the various kinds of things that were happening in America at the time. It's not a historical novel, and that I'm trying to represent that moment, but it's an attempt to use that moment to speak to some larger issues about our relationships with other people, and questions of family, questions of love, questions of creativity, all these kinds of things. So, I guess what I'm saying is, like, creating, that's all part of just creating a character. I would say it's not easy to do that for me. But once you really try to think yourself into another person's skin, that becomes part of what it's all about. So, yeah. Another question. Thank you.
Are there recordings of him playing, or are people playing his music?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yeah, just to be clear about that, I'm not sure if I explained it well. So, he begins performing essentially around 1855 or something like that, and pretty much stops performing in late 1880s. So, this is all before the period of recorded music. As far as I know, there are not even any piano rolls that exist of any of his compositions or anything like that. So, what happened, though, is I did mention before that there are, this biographer was able to find like 500 compositions that have been credited to him. And some of those compositions have been professionally recorded, in fact. So to start, this biographer, Janila Southall herself, was a musicologist and pianist, and she did essentially a kind of small private recording of some of Blind Tom's compositions for the University of Minnesota, which is where she taught. And so that was never made available to the public except through that library. And I actually went there and found it, and found a copy of that. But the person who has done the most really to keep Blind Tom's music alive is a guy named John Davis, who is a pianist and lives in Brooklyn. And actually, we become friends. He came to one of my readings, and he was sitting in the audience, and I was talking about him. Didn't even know that was him. So luckily, I didn't say anything I shouldn't have said. But so John Davis has done one recording of Blind Tom compositions completely, and then on a number of other CDs, he's done other recordings of some of the compositions, and also he performs all around the world, Blind Tom's music, and I believe he also has an extensive collection of Blind Tom memorabilia and this kind of thing. So if you're interested in actually hearing what the music sounds like, that would be the place to start. So you can find, if you go on YouTube, in fact, you can find a number of performances of him playing Blind Tom's music. One of the interesting things about that, is when I first began writing the book, John Davis's first CD had not come out yet, which was actually good for me because at a certain point, really, I decided that I wouldn't listen to it. When I saw the CD, I decided, well, I'm not going to listen to it. And when I found this other CD in the Minnesota Library, University of Minnesota Library, I decided I didn't want to listen to it because what I really wanted to do was to create in my own mind, in my own imagination, a sense of what Tom's music sounded like. And I didn't want those recordings to interfere with that. So I didn't listen to those recordings until, many years later, until really the book was done pretty much, and I was in the revising process. And probably shouldn't say this, but I suppose when you are so into your imagination and you've got these great ideas about what the music sounded like. When you hear the recordings, it's something else, you know. It's not that they're bad, but like clearly, like the compositions he wrote were pretty much, well, most of the compositions were an imitation of the music of the time, or they were, you know, imitated other kinds of piano music, whether it was Chopin or Liszt or whomever, you know. And like the kinds of songs that I was really intrigued by, like, you know, he had these songs where he tried to imitate the sound of a sewing machine and imitate the sound of a rainstorm and those kinds of things, and some of that's actually been transcribed, and John Davis has done a recording of a couple of those songs, but you know, that was kind of interesting to hear those sort of experimental pieces. But like the music I was really interested in, ultimately what I discovered, the thing that was most fascinating about him for me as a musician was his stage performances. You know, he was billed as the Blind Tom exhibition because he could do all these crazy things on stage, you know, and I guess he just really blew people's minds, you know. Like, so I really wanted to know what those playing the three songs at once sounded like, or when he did other kinds of things like that, like what did all that sound like? And there's of course no record of that really, because you know, you can't really transcribe something like that. So so that part of Blind Tom's musical existence is totally, you know, gone really in that way, you know, since there are no recordings, and there are only the descriptions that, you know, people wrote in reviews and things. So yeah. Yes.
In your mind, did you have someone's music or certain music in your mind as you tried to imagine what his sound would be like?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, one of the interesting things about the book for me is it's, you know, for anyone who sort of really likes music, if you know, study the book, you'll find like there's all this musical history that's just embedded in the book. You know, I mean, I knew nothing about classical music pretty much when I started writing the book, and I read everything I could and still don't know anything about it probably to this day. But so, you know, like if I found like something interesting that Chopin said about what he was doing, I would write that in a notebook and try to figure out how I can use it. So there's stuff like that. But more importantly, I really was trying to think about how Tom's music, you know, who would be the contemporary equivalent of Tom, or, you know, fairly contemporary equivalent. And so those, you know, basically a lot of modern musicians became the model for him, you know. Like, or another way of putting it like this, so we, you know, like most people have written about him assume that he was this savant, or he's a autistic savant, and Oliver Sacks, you know, makes that assumption. Maybe he was, I don't know, I mean, who knows. But, you know, the thing is, like, if you really look at modern musicians, they're all crazy, right? I mean, like, it's, you know, musicians come from another planet. I mean, that's just how they are, you know, and how they move in the world. So, like, when you think about some of Tom's antics and things that, you know, that are recorded, like, that's not all that, you know, it would be perfectly understandable today. Like, if people were, you know, like I was reading, I didn't use this in the book, but I read about one account where apparently he was in a hotel somewhere and got angry at one of the bellhops or something and threw the guy out of the room. You know, I mean, didn't Led Zeppelin do stuff like that? You know, so, you know, so actually I began to think a little bit about that, like. In other words, like, where does autism and the musician merge in terms of metaphor? Like, so I read Temple Grandin's book about, you know, what it feels, you know, you all know Temple Grandin, who's written about autism because she herself is autistic. And one of the things that she says is how, like, you know, what it means to be an autistic. It feels like you are an alien, because she has no sense of what human emotion is like. And so how does that, you know, that sense of alienation, of being an alien, merge with this thing of being a musician, which is also this other completely different kind of existence, you know? So, so in that broader sense, I thought about the music in that way, and then I started to think about once again, like I thought, like, well, Jimi Hendrix would be a model for maybe what some of the music would sound like in our own time, or Rashawn Roland Kirk, or there's an incredible jazz saxophonist who I really love named James Carter. I don't know if any of you know his music at all, but he, when you hear him play the saxophone, it's just like something completely out of this world, and he's an amazing performer, and all that. So those were some of the people I had in mind as models for the music, and so yeah. So yeah. Oh, that's a question. Okay. Yes.
When you first saw an image of Blind Tom, what was your reaction? What did you think?
Well, that's actually a good question, because there are. I answer a different question, but I try to answer that as well. So one of the things that in the end happened, I decided to use images in the book, and there's a whole history about that in its own way. But ultimately, what I decided to do is never to use an actual image of him. There is one image of him, actual image of him in the book, but it's so blurry you don't really know it's him, and it's a really ghostly kind of image. And so I wanted that to be representation. But like the images you see of him, the ones that exist are all staged, of course. They were typical kind of 19th century portraits where he sat in a chair and he was clearly staged, that kind of thing. So the images don't say a whole lot necessarily for me, There are no images of him smiling or anything like that. All the images, he's stone-faced and just kind of stiff, and but at the same time, I think some of the images that were really inspiring and that I got excited about, I was hunting around, and actually I found an image of his signature, which was quite amazing, like, wow, this is Blind Tom's signature, And how did that come about? Well, apparently, like, among other things, he would at some of his concerts, they would sell these, tickets essentially that was used to raise money for the Confederates, and I guess he would sign some of these so people would have that as a kind of souvenir. And I was also excited when I found some images of the original sheet music of his songs that were sold, and so some of that stuff was really quite interesting, So that was all quite fascinating, So yeah. Yes.
I've heard Jimi Hendrix mentioned a couple times. Jimi Hendrix of the 19th century.
Yeah.
I remember Jimmy was pretty much a child of the 1960s in quite a few different ways. Just how do you mean Jimi Hendrix of the 19th century?
Yeah, that's a vague expression. What I mean by that really is it's just a way of saying, like, clearly Blind Tom wasn't playing jazz. He wasn't playing rock. His primary music was European classical music. So, but what I mean is, like, in terms of this other stuff he was doing, like, that seemed pretty avant-garde for the time. Like these compositions that involve these imitations of man-made phenomena and natural phenomena. These situations where he would invite members of the audience to come up and play original compositions, and then he would play them back and improvise on them apparently, and all these kinds of things. So what I meant by that, what I mean by the Jimi Hendrix is just that sense of kind of, taking the music and pushing it in these unusual directions. That's what I mean by it. And, and Jimi Hendrix is the wrong name, really. It's the wrong metaphor. It's because it's personal for me. That's my own attachment. It's my love for Jimi Hendrix's music that allowed me to see Blind Tom in him, and I'm sure I'm completely wrong in doing that. But that's what it means to be a writer. So writers are wrong, but being wrong is part of how you see the world and what you have to say. But I was actually asked this question in an interview, like, who today would be Blind Tom? And of course, no one would be, right? I mean, because he was a product of his own time, right? He was a product of his own time. But if you think about it, like, if you say, well, you take this crazy idea and say that musicians are from other planets, then they are also, always from other times too. So, so sure, maybe there's some. One might think of Stevie Wonder because he was also a pianist. One might think of George Shearing, who was also blind and a pianist, and maybe one could bring to mind these types of people. But they were, George Shearing was a jazz pianist, Stevie Wonder, something else. So there are no similarities, I don't think, in that way in terms of the music. But I suppose in the way I imagine the music, at least sometimes in a novel, I try to think about those, the non-classical stuff, let's call it that. Like I try to think about how that might have worked in terms of African American tradition of call and response and improvisation, and African American idioms, musical idioms, and or the way Jimi Hendrix took the blues and made it into something else, which is basically what he did among other things, or the way that Roland Kirk took, could take a ballad and then bring all of this avant-garde stuff into it with his 3 saxophones or something and make that ballad into something else, that idea of, as someone said, like, I was reading once where one of the, I think it was the son of the Adolphus saxophonist or whatever his name was, the guy who invented the saxophone, and he heard the way that jazz musicians were playing the saxophone, and said, "Oh, that's not the way it was. That's not the way it's supposed to, what the instrument was intended for." So I was thinking about that, like how Blind Tom was using the piano for in ways that it wasn't intended for, and that's very much in the spirit of African American improvisation, I think. So that's where Jimi Hendrix and the guitar come in, or Rashawn Roland Kirk and the saxophone, or maybe Stevie Wonder and the piano, or whatever, So, yeah. I know that's an elaborate answer. It's all a lie, but nevertheless. So, any other questions, or yes?
Did you run across in current times anybody that could perform similar musical feats?
That's an excellent question. I haven't heard of anybody today who's been doing like the 3 songs at once or anything like that. But well, you do run across some unusual things, actually. I mean, among other things, I didn't talk about this, but he apparently could, he could use his voice to imitate, not only a large vocal range, but like he could sound like, basically sound like anybody, like he could sound like a man or a woman or a child, and he would give these orations and stuff where he would sound like maybe Stephen Douglas or someone, or these kinds of things. But I was watching a recording online, and it was Layla Hathaway who was singing, and apparently it was this, I don't know, I'm not a musician, really don't know all about this, but she was singing, but apparently sang a chord, which is supposed to be technically impossible to do, right? To sing more than one note at once, right? Isn't that impossible? So wow, that was kind of amazing, and that apparently she did it without using any effects. So, like that, I mean, there are people who seem to, but I think the way I would best answer that question is just to, I think we've all had this experience where you go hear some live music and it's just like, it's indescribable in terms of how it moves you, and I think, like, I always feel like that's ultimately what the book should be about. If you can never really capture that on the page, but I remember, for example, when after 9/11, a couple of weeks after 9/11, I went to hear this singer, bass player named Richard Bona at a jazz club in New York. I think it was at the Blue Note, maybe. And you still couldn't really get around then. I think most of the planes were delayed or backed up, and he actually had been playing in Detroit, and he had to take a taxi from Detroit to New York to play that night. And then, you know, it was just, when he started singing, it was the most amazing thing. It's like, you know, wow, you know, it was, I can't even tell you, and I don't even remember, I just remember being totally enraptured that night, like, wow, this is the medicine that we all need here in this devastated city. It was just amazing, you know, like, and I think that, like, those kinds of moments would speak to what the music really is, you know, so what the best of music always is, you know, so. Is that a wrap? Thank you. Thank you.
The book is Song of the Shank. We have them for sale right behind the counter. Jeffrey will sign them right here for you, for those of you here. For those of you watching on the internet, please give us a call. We'll get one signed and we'll ship it to you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all again.